Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains forgotten. And today, we are going to discuss some locomotives from history that were actually really good, frankly. They were exceptional in some ways, but for reasons that vary between each entry, they were kind of just overlooked, forgotten, put off to the side, and even historical accounts don't really talk about them that much. They're just kind of lost in the ether. These are 5 trains that history forgot. The Santa Fe 5000. Now this one isn't quite as forgotten in a sense, but it definitely feels like this particular locomotive gets overlooked a lot, and that's probably because it is one of a kind. The Santa Fe 5000 was a 210-4 Texas type steam locomotive. Now Texas types were also kind of overlooked. They appeared pretty late to the scene when it came to steam technology, and they didn't see that much use, and they're certainly not as famous as other types, but in their own way, the Texas type was actually quite exceptional. Number 5000 was just one example of this type when she was constructed by Baldwin in 1930 for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. She was nicknamed Madam Queen, and the reason why she was in her own class is, well, first of all, she was astonishingly successful. Let's make that very clear. Madam Queen was an excellent steam locomotive, by all accounts. When she was placed in service between the Clovis and Vaughan, New Mexico line for observation, it was found that she would pull 15% more tonnage in 9% less time, while burning 17% less coal per 1,000 gross ton miles, when compared to the railway's 3800 series of 210-2s. The point was that the Madam Queen was showing that the 5000 series was something that could be considered exceptional and would boost the railway's overall cost effectiveness as well as productivity. So why did she remain alone forever? Well, that's because of the Great Depression. Santa Fe took a huge hit financially during that time, as did every railway, and they adopted a new policy of avoiding capital expenditures while the Depression was going on. They did actually eventually invest in more Texas-type locomotives that were delivered by 1938, but their designs had taken up new alterations. They were in many ways different from Madam Queen, so they were placed in a class of their own. Madam Queen, as good as she was, never received any siblings as a result, and in many ways she somehow fell by the wayside even when it came to Santa Fe, because the newer 210-4s had been given improvements. Now, all that said, she wasn't completely forgotten, and this is one of the happier stories we have here, as she was eventually placed into storage by the railway, not scrapped. And on April 17, 1957, she was officially retired and donated to the city of Amarillo, Texas. For many years after that, she sat on outdoor static display at the Santa Fe station in that town. Then, in August of 2005, she was moved by the Railroad Artifact Preservation Society to a new location, 500 Southeast 2nd Avenue, where they plan on constructing a building to house and preserve her. And while she's somewhat overlooked historically, she can hopefully remain a permanent museum piece for many years to come. The Bulgarian State Railways, Class 46. Hello, Bulgaria! This is a country we have not yet discussed. I'm always excited to get new countries around here. And yes, we definitely need to talk about your Class 46s, because they are, especially when it comes to Europe, big chungus. These 20 steam locomotives were constructed between 1931 and 1943. They are 2 12-4 steam locomotives. 12 driving wheels. Big steam locomotives. The Bulgarian railwaymen gave them the nickname Mother Bear because they felt they looked fat, clumsy, and compact, but man were they powerful. They were designed to haul heavy coal trains on mountainous lines, and based on that specific purpose, they were astonishingly successful. They were good at their job. They may have been the most powerful steam locomotives to actually operate in Europe. Though this fact is somewhat debatable, I can safely say that they are definitely one of the most powerful steam locomotives to operate in Europe. So why are they overlooked? After all, this wheel arrangement isn't that different from 412-2, which is the wheel arrangement for the Union Pacific 9000 series. Pretty much the only difference between them is that they reverse the leading and trailing wheels. And that does change the physics slightly. The point is, the driving wheels are the same. So what gives? Well, if I had to guess, I'd say the reason why you probably haven't even heard of these locomotives is that you don't live in Bulgaria. See, when it comes to the world stage, there are a lot of countries that tend to get more international acclaim when it comes to certain stuff. The superpowers, for example, USA, Russia, China, are all on the table. When it comes to locomotives, well, the UK and all their former colonies definitely get noticed a lot more. After all, UK did invent trains, so I get that point. But outside of them, a lot of other countries' locomotive history tends to stay rather local. And I had to dig a little harder than I usually do to get information about the Class 46s. And if I had to guess, I'd just say that Bulgaria just doesn't get noticed a lot on the world stage. I'm not saying that's right or that's fair. And listen, I live in a country where we do nothing but announce our presence as the greatest country on earth in every situation. So, in terms of not being obnoxious, you have my respect, Bulgaria. And in that regard, it seems that local rail fans in Bulgaria do give credit where it's due, as 2 of the Class 46s are actually in preservation. And one of them, 46.03, was actually restored to running condition and returned to steam power in May of 2015. So, that's actually awesome, phenomenal, I love it.
Witness this unrelenting torrent of Bulgarian power.
The British Rail Class D16/1. I don't wanna. You can't make me do this anymore. To be fair, these locomotives actually weren't initially a British rail creation, necessarily. They were actually constructed in association with English Electric by the London, Midland and Scottish Railway at Derby Works. They were built between 1947 and 1948, though British Rail would take over just the following year, and under them, they became the Class D16/1. These 2 units are very notable as they are the first mainline diesel locomotives that were built in Great Britain. And you might think that that means they were really, really bad, because, yeah, but as it turns out, no, not really, which is why I feel like they got overlooked. I don't get many people talking about these. People mention the Fell diesel all the time, but not these 2. And I think it's mostly that while they weren't necessarily awful, they were just kind of unremarkable. They didn't really do the work that much better, if at all, when compared to a traditional steam locomotive. They also did have some limited reliability issues, but this seems mostly down to poor maintenance, rather than them being actually legitimately bad. They had a few overhauls over the course of their lives, but as time went on and other companies began to innovate when it came to diesel designs, the D16/1s just kind of fell by the wayside. They weren't able to compete with more modern diesels, despite they themselves actually being kind of alright. And in many ways, they are the reason why British Rail pushed so hard to make everything diesel, as they showed the potential of the technology. They were good enough to do that. They had a max speed of 93 miles per hour, or 150 kilometers per hour, and a power output over 1600 horsepower. When they were maintained properly, they were actually legitimately good diesels. It's just everyone kind of forgot about them after a while. Sadly though, both of them wound up being scrapped. They were not considered for preservation. Despite the fact that some railwaymen actually tried to convince British Rail to do this. As compared to a lot of the other diesels, the D16s had proven to be a joy to work with. Number 10,000 was actually offered to the Clapham Railway Museum, but they refused her on the grounds that she didn't actually represent a legitimate class. Technically, the D16s were only prototypes. Which, okay, yes, but I feel like in a way that makes them even more historically relevant. They're very unique. People love that in museums. What are you talking about, Clapham? The railwaymen were so desperate to at least save number 10,001 that, similarly to some old steam locomotives allegedly were preserved this way, they actually hid her in the back of Willesden Depot. And every time they were caught, they just said, oh, she must have been overlooked for removal. Yeah, definitely, that's what happened. Where is that diesel? I want that diesel destroyed. Yeah, I don't know, boss. It could be anywhere. It's old. It's not modern enough for us. We must create the most modern railway the world has ever seen. It is a blight on the glory of British rail. Okay, first of all, you probably need to chill out with the tea. I don't know how much you've had today, but apparently it's a lot. And second of all, don't worry, I found it. It must have been overlooked. Don't worry. It'll go next time. Next time to the scrapyard, I promise. You promise? I promise. Well, okay. I believe you. I promise. Definitely. Put the sheet back on her. Put the sheet... Just put it back on her. Don't move her. Keep her there. Sadly, it didn't actually work. Eventually, they were forced to scrap 10,001. But in 2011, the Ivet Diesel Recreation Society announced plans to actually build a replica of number 10,000. They would use contemporary parts, as well as new build components. They purchased a Class 58 diesel which will be used for the chassis, and are currently in talks to figure out how best to go about it, but while the originals are gone, you may be able to see a replica of one operating someday. Well, that's something. The British Rail Class 53, otherwise known as the Falcon. The locomotive was number D0280. The Falcon was created in 1961 by Brush Traction, a diesel-electric. It was the sole example of its prototype unit. With a top speed of 100 miles per hour, or 161 kilometers an hour, and a power output of nearly 3,000 horsepower, the Falcon was actually a very impressive piece of work, and even as a prototype it was considered very, very successful. So, I guess that stands to reason, and this is a fair question, why in the heck didn't we see more of the Class 53s? Well, that's because of timing. British Rail got wishy-washy when it came to deciding whether or not to put the Falcon into production. In the early 60s, they spent a great deal of money on a ton of different diesels, and it just so happens that the Falcon turned out to be just like the one. That they were like, no, we'll take the prototype, but we're not actually going to ask for any more. Which is hysterical, because the Falcon was legitimately good. But by the time they thought seriously about producing more of it, the available locomotive technology had actually advanced beyond the Falcon. This was by the 70s, so the Falcon never got any siblings as a result, though she was good enough to serve until 1975. By then she was declared uneconomic because she was non-standard. There were efforts to preserve it, but this never happened. She was cut up for scrap by April of 1976. The ALCO DL109. ALCO is one of those companies that used to be great. They really were. They were exceptional when it came to steam locomotive design, but when the market shifted over to diesel locomotives, they got really rocky. It's often assumed that both them and Baldwin were terrible at making diesels, and it's not fair to outright say that, I don't think. They weren't great at it, but they did have some legitimately good diesel locomotives put out there. And the 109s were a legitimately good example of this. With a maximum speed of 120 miles per hour, or 193 kilometers an hour, and a power output of 2,000 horsepower, for 1939 these were an exceptional diesel locomotive. A total of 74 cab units were produced, plus 4 booster units on top of that. And despite EMD's dominance, several railways did give these a shot, though the biggest one was New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, who bought 60 of these things. Any other buyers only bought 1 or 2, but no, New Haven was like, we need all of them, please. But to be fair, New Haven found them exceptional. They enjoyed them quite a lot, and were impressed with ALCO's technology. But outside of there, they never really became a permanent fixture on rail lines, putting ALCO well behind EMD, that it sold just so many E and F units it's not even funny. And the 109s weren't just overshadowed by EMD, They were also overshadowed by arguably ALCO's most famous diesel entry, the ALCO PA. And to be honest, this is probably just because the PA looks so nice, and they're beautiful locomotives, looking a lot sleeker and more distinctive than the 109s that just look kinda like a depressed E unit. And that's not really fair at all, cause aesthetics aside, the 109s are arguably much better than the PAs. The PAs have better potential because they're newer, but the 109s were way more reliable, easily able to compete with EMD in that regard. But because the PAs look nicer, and EMD was way more dominant, the DL109s were kind of sandwiched between the two historically speaking. And I'd be willing to bet many casual rail fans had never heard of these things. But for their time, they were actually exceptionally good, and proved that ALCO, when they applied themselves, could make good diesels. It just didn't happen all the time. It didn't happen most of the time, to be brutally honest. And before we go, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Some Dude 267, Brightline Blue Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose Tribal Typhoon, Master of None Josh Johnson, and Lock Kraken. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.